Usually, when we observe a failure, whether that's in civil engineering or really just everyday life, there's this built-in expectation of absolute finality.
Right, like a definitive end.
Exactly. If a suspension bridge collapses, the structural engineers look at the twisted steel in the river, and the conclusion is just done. The physics failed. The project is over. It's a clean, binary state of broken or not broken.
And, I mean, that's comforting in a deeply psychological way, you know?
hmm
Human beings are sort of wired to categorize outcomes into these neat, visible boxes.
Yeah, we crave that
We
certainty.
really do. We want the binary system. Success goes in one column, failure goes in the exact opposite column. And you just learn to avoid the failure column at all costs.
But the moment you step into the ecosystem of high-growth startups or venture capital mathematics or just attempting to build a multi-billion-dollar entity from scratch, that binary framework doesn't just crack, it completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely. In this specific ecosystem, failure isn't a termination point at all. It's actually an incredibly misunderstood foundational mechanic of scale.
Yeah, what the general public views as a smoking crater, a visionary founder views as like a freshly excavated foundation for a skyscraper.
Which requires a complete rewiring of your baseline assumptions. And that's precisely the paradigm shift we are dissecting today. We're exploring a landscape where your initial idea is almost guaranteed to be wrong.
And where recognizing that wrongness is the only actual path to monumental scale. So, okay, let's unpack this.
What we do?
We are pulling our frameworks today from a deeply analytical set of essays published around mid-March 2026 on the Netizen blog. It's authored by Paramendra Kumar Pagat.
And our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct the actual mechanics of exponential growth.
Right. But before we get into the architecture of scaling a business, I do want to clearly harness the nature of our source material, because Pagat's blog is incredibly expansive.
Yeah, he covers a lot of ground.
He writes about the dawn of a 10x tech economy, artificial intelligence, macroeconomics. But if you look at the archives, you'll also see a variety of highly politically charged commentary in fiction.
Right, there are titles in there like Barack Face, or Trump's Default, or AOC 2028.
Yeah, and we want to be exceptionally clear to you listening right now. Our analysis today is completely impartial regarding those political titles. We are not endorsing them, nor are we critiquing them.
Exactly. We are simply acknowledging them as context. It shows that this author looks at the world through a very wide macroscopic lens. He's constantly analyzing how societies and human behavior shift.
Yep. For our purposes, our sole laser-focused objective is to extract his strategic frameworks regarding entrepreneurship and business mechanics.
Isolating the mechanical business logic. And that logic really centers on two radically counterintuitive concepts that separate the massive, category-defining companies from the graveyard of forgotten startups.
The first one being the up pivot.
Right. We're tearing down the mythology of the standard business pivot to examine the structural power of the up pivot. And second, we're going to explore this premise that goes against the very DNA of startup culture.
The radical argument that treating marketing as an internal, do-it-yourself project is actually a fatal error in the modern economy.
Yes, but to understand the up pivot, I mean, we really have to start with the most terrifying statistic in the entire business world.
The 90% rule?
According to organizations like CB Insights, roughly 90% of all startups fail. 9 out of 10.
Which, if you hear that statistic in a vacuum, it sounds like a massive, flashing red warning sign, you know?
Yeah, it's the data point that convinces rational people to turn around and accept a safe, salaried corporate job.
It really functions like a ghost story in Silicon Valley. It's meant to scare away the uncommitted. But the core argument we're analyzing today insists that viewing that 90% metric as a death toll is a profound misunderstanding.
Almost a catastrophic misunderstanding of how innovation actually functions. It isn't a warning. It's simply the baseline cost of running a massive global probabilistic equation.
Right, because if you only look at the 90% failure rate, you are completely ignoring the numerator of this equation.
Exactly. As of the mid-2020s, there are over 1,300 privately held startups that have achieved unicorn status.
Meaning they're valued at over $1 billion each, 1,300 of them.
And collectively, their valuation sits at over $5.6 trillion.
Trillion with a T. That represents an amount of wealth and infrastructural scale that is almost difficult for the human brain to even visualize.
What's really fascinating here is that the word unicorn was originally coined to describe something mythically rare. And now we're looking at a herd of over 1,000 of them.
Yeah, the math has totally changed.
It has. And the fundamental premise of the text is that if you look at the origin stories of these $5.6 trillion giant companies like Uber, Stripe, Airbnb, Slack, almost none of them began as fully formed, obvious, multi-billion-dollar concepts.
They absolutely did not launch with the perfect product market fit on day one. They all started as incredibly fragile experiments.
Which is why I think the scientific experiment is the only viable mental model for this.
Yes, exactly. If you view a startup as a machine, and you turn the machine on and it doesn't print money, you say the machine is broken.
Right, it's a failure.
But if you view a startup as a fragile experiment in a laboratory, the mindset completely changes. If a scientist runs an experiment and the resulting data completely disproves their initial hypothesis, that scientist doesn't say, well, my career is over, science is a lie.
No, they say, this is fascinating. I just gathered crucial empirical data about what does not work.
Exactly. They isolate the variables, they adjust the hypothesis, and they run the next iteration.
And that cognitive reframing is the exact demarcation line between the 90% that vanish and the 1,300 that reshape the global economy.
It's not about having unlimited venture capital.
And it certainly isn't having perfect timing. It is the founder's capacity to look at that negative empirical data, completely detach their ego from their original idea, and execute an up pivot.
Okay, up pivot. Because the word pivot has been beaten into the ground over the last decade.
Oh, completely. It's become startup vernacular for a desperate scramble to keep the lights on.
Yeah, it usually implies a lateral move or even a retreat, like, oh, our enterprise software was too complicated, so we pivoted to a simple consumer to-do list app.
Right. It's a defensive maneuver. But an up pivot is structurally entirely different. An up pivot is an intentional, calculated, aggressive expansion in ambition, in scale, and in strategic scope.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. When an ordinary founder hits a wall, meaning customer acquisition costs are too high or churn is out of control, their immediate instinct is to ask, how do we fix what is broken so we can survive another 6 months?
They look for patches.
But when a unicorn trajectory founder hits that exact same wall, they look at the data and ask a much more audacious question. They ask, what would this company need to look like to be 10 times larger than my original vision?
But this requires a massive suspension of conventional business logic. Think about it. If my core unit economics are bleeding, if my users are abandoning the platform, and my burn rate gives me exactly 8 months of runway, my board of directors isn't going to let me just reimagine the company 10 times larger. They're going to demand that I cut costs, fire half the marketing team, and fix the immediate leaks.
So how do you justify expanding the vision when the current smaller vision is actively failing?
Because the failure itself is an indicator that the current market or the product premise is fundamentally flawed. If you spend your remaining runway incrementally patching a flawed premise, you don't save the company.
You just extend the duration of the bleeding.
Exactly. An up pivot recognizes that fixing what is broken only gets you back to the baseline of a mediocre idea. Expanding the vision 10 times over, reimagining the product to be an order of magnitude better, actually changes the math of the entire investment.
It expands the total addressable market, the TAM.
Right. It makes the old problems irrelevant because you're suddenly playing an entirely different game with entirely different economics.
It's the practical application of the famous 10x mindset that incubators like Y Combinator have championed for years. You are not trying to create a 10% improvement on the status quo.
Because if you aim for a 10% improvement, you're inherently competing against entrenched incumbents on their own terms, using their own rules.
A 10x improvement requires you to change the fundamental mechanism of the industry. You aren't building a slightly better mousetrap. You're engineering an environment where mice can no longer exist.
That's a great way to put it. Let's look at the urban transportation market prior to Uber. The incumbent was the taxi medallion system.
Right.
If you applied a 10% incremental improvement mindset to that industry, what would you get? You might build a dispatch software that reduces wait times by 3 minutes, or maybe a slightly cleaner cab network.
But you're still operating within the artificial scarcity of the medallion system. You're just putting a fresh coat of paint on a broken paradigm.
Precisely. Uber didn't do that. They looked at the friction of the entire system and executed a 10x leap in logic. The fundamental constraint wasn't the dispatchers. It was the artificial limit on the supply of drivers.
Right. They hypothesized that anyone with a car could represent latent supply.
And they introduced a system that unlocked that supply, made it instantly accessible via a smartphone, introduced transparent pricing algorithms that adjusted to real-time demand, and removed the physical friction of payment entirely.
They didn't improve the taxi. They replaced the concept of urban transportation with a liquid, real-time marketplace. That is a 10x up pivot from the baseline of just improving a cab ride.
And what the source material makes incredibly clear is that this 10x algorithm is not something you run once during your seed round and then just coast on for a decade.
Oh no, it's a continuous, relentless loop. The ambition has to be perpetually audited and expanded. And there is no better illustration of this continuous up pivot than the architectural evolution of Amazon.
Everyone knows the Genesis story. Jeff Bezos leaves Wall Street, drives to Seattle, and starts selling books out of a garage.
The initial 10x leap there was realizing that the internet removed the physical constraints of retail. A Barnes& Noble can only stock maybe 100,000 titles before they just run out of square footage. Amazon could offer infinite shelf space.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Amazon is the masterclass in refusing to settle into a static market. Once they proved the unit economics of shipping books, they didn't just become the world's best bookstore.
Right. They executed their first massive up pivot. They applied the infinite shelf space model to all retail goods. They transitioned from a bookstore to the everything store.
But to actually deliver on the promise of the everything store, they encountered a massive infrastructural bottleneck. The existing third-party shipping and warehousing networks were just not capable of handling their projected volume.
So instead of scaling back their ambition to match the available infrastructure, they up-pivoted again. They decided to build a massive proprietary logistics and supply chain network from scratch.
They built the warehouses, they wrote the sorting algorithms, they leased the literal planes.
And here is where the genius of the continuous up-pivot truly manifests. Because to operate that global logistics network and to process the millions of transactions for the everything store, Amazon had to build an unprecedented amount of internal server capacity.
They needed massive computational power, especially to handle those insane traffic spikes during the Q4 holiday shopping season. But for the rest of the year, a significant portion of those expensive servers just sat idle. It was a massive fixed cost.
They looked at this massive internal cost center, basically their own operational exhaust, and they asked the 10x question. What if this server infrastructure isn't just a cost of doing business? What if the infrastructure is actually a product?
And that is the birth of Amazon Web Services, AWS.
They took their internal primitive services like storage, compute power, databases, wrapped them in clean APIs, and rented them out to the rest of the world. They up-pivoted from being an e-commerce company to being the foundational utility grid of the modern internet.
It is staggering when you map it out. They start with paperbacks, and through a series of ruthless, logical up-pivots, they become the dominant force in global cloud computing.
Today, AWS generates tens of billions of dollars in highly profitable revenue. It effectively subsidizes the razor-thin margins of their retail delivery business.
The lesson isn't just about having a good idea. It's about continuously asking, what is the next order of magnitude for the assets we have just built?
And this maps perfectly onto the life cycle of a startup. A company moves through distinct phases: the initial idea, the desperate search for product-market fit, the scaling phase, and market dominance.
And at every single one of those junctures, the data will present a fork in the road. The founders have to make a conscious choice. Do we play it safe and optimize incrementally, or do we risk what we have to up-pivot?
I really want to take this out of the theoretical realm and look at the actual round-level mechanics of these choices. Because if you're listening to this and you are building a product, the temptation to just keep pushing the rock up the hill is immense.
Oh yeah, you have sunk costs, investor expectations, your own ego tied to the code.
Exactly. So let's look at the anatomical breakdown of early-stage product pivots that completely altered the tech landscape. Let's start with Slack.
Slack is the textbook example of extracting a massive victory from the jaws of absolute failure. The company did not begin as an enterprise communication tool. It started as an incredibly ambitious, highly complex online multiplayer game called Glitch.
Think about the capital and the human hours involved in that. You raise millions of dollars. You hire game designers, artists, engineers. You spend years building the physics engines, the server architectures, the gameplay loops.
And you launch the game, and the market effectively shrugs. The user acquisition costs are too high, the retention is terrible, it is a catastrophic failure.
The psychological weight of having to shut down those servers and lay off that staff must have been agonizing.
It's the ultimate test of founder psychology. Stuart Butterfield and his team could have easily folded the company and returned whatever remaining capital to the investors, but they had developed a habit of obsessive internal observation.
Right. While building Glitch, the development team was spread across different cities. To coordinate the complex game development, they hadn't used standard email. They had custom-built their own internal communication protocol.
It was an asynchronous channel-based chat system.
They realized that while the game they spent years building was worthless to the market, the internal tool they built just to facilitate the game was actually a goldmine. The byproduct of the failure was the actual 10x product.
So they executed a massive up pivot, stripped away the entire game, isolated the communication architecture, polished the user interface, and launched it as Slack.
They pivoted out of the brutal, hit-driven consumer gaming market and up-pivoted into the massive, sticky, highly lucrative enterprise SaaS market.
And it requires immense humility to admit that your side project is better than your life's work. We see the exact same mechanical extraction in the story of Instagram.
Oh, Berber.
Yes. Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger originally built an app called Bourbon, and if you look at the early screenshots of Bourbon, it is a convoluted mess of a product.
It really was. It was a location-based check-in app, kind of heavily inspired by Foursquare. But it also let you make future plans with friends, earn points, and almost as an afterthought, post photos of where you were.
They had packed way too many features into a single interface. It was causing massive cognitive overload for the users. But instead of just guessing what to fix, they dove deeply into their server analytics.
And the data painted a very clear, very surprising picture. Users were entirely ignoring the check-in mechanics. They were ignoring the planning features.
They were actively bypassing 90% of the app's functionality just to access the photo sharing tool and apply the custom visual filters.
They were using a complex Swiss Army knife solely for the toothpick. So the founders faced a choice. Do they spend marketing dollars trying to educate the users on how to properly use the check-in features they had spent months coding? Or do they listen to the behavioral data?
They chose the data. They made the incredibly courageous architectural decision to delete almost their entire code base. They stripped away every single feature except for the photos, the filters, and the ability to like and comment.
They up-pivoted by drastically narrowing their focus. They removed the friction, and by doing so, they unlocked a 10x growth trajectory that culminated in a billion-dollar acquisition by Facebook.
It's the exact same pattern with Pinterest. The founders originally launched an app called Tote, which was conceived as a mobile commerce platform. The idea was to browse items on your phone and buy them.
But the mobile checkout infrastructure at the time was just terrible. The payment gateways were clunky, and users simply were not converting into buyers. The core business model was failing.
But the founders observed a secondary behavior. Users were obsessively saving pictures of items they liked, creating massive digital collections. They weren't buying, but they were curating.
So instead of fighting the friction of mobile payments, they up-pivoted into the behavioral frictionlessness of curation. They abandoned the shopping cart entirely and built the world's most robust digital vision board.
They stopped trying to be a transaction engine and became an inspiration engine.
All three of these examples share a specific structural mechanic. The companies themselves didn't fail. Their initial hypotheses about user behavior failed.
Right. The founders survived because they were able to decouple their ego from the original code base and pivot upward into the reality of what the market actually wanted.
But what happens when the product is fine, but the delivery mechanism becomes obsolete? This brings us to the business model up pivot, which is perfectly exemplified by Netflix.
Netflix in 1997 had a brilliant, highly functional business model. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph realized that the introduction of the lightweight DVD format meant movies could be shipped via standard postal mail,
allowing them to bypass the massive real estate costs of Blockbuster video stores. They built a highly profitable, recurring revenue business shipping those little red envelopes.
And if they were incremental thinkers, they would have just spent the next decade optimizing their postal sorting machines to save like 3 cents per envelope.
But they were looking at the macroeconomic data. They were watching the expansion of broadband internet penetration across the United States.
So in 2007, they made a breathtakingly dangerous up pivot. They decided to launch a digital streaming service. Now, from a business perspective, this is terrifying.
Yeah, you're actively introducing a product that is designed to cannibalize your own highly profitable core DVD business. You're trading a known revenue stream with established physical logistics for an unknown digital model reliant on massive server costs.
and complex studio licensing negotiations.
It's the classic innovator's dilemma. If you don't disrupt yourself, someone else will. So they up-pivot to streaming, and the scale of the company explodes.
Suddenly, they aren't constrained by the speed of the U.S. Postal Service. Their delivery is instantaneous and global. But then, a few years later, the landscape shifts again.
Right. Every major tech and media company realizes that streaming is the future. Amazon launches Prime Video, Hulu gains traction, and the massive media conglomerates start pulling their licensed movies off of Netflix to build their own platforms.
Netflix looked at the shifting chessboard and realized that if they only acted as a digital delivery pipe for other people's movies, they would eventually be squeezed out of existence. The studios would simply hike the licensing fees until Netflix's margins collapsed.
So they execute a second massive up-pivot. They decide to become a production studio themselves.
They drop a massive amount of capital to produce House of Cards, securing exclusive original content.
They up-pivoted from being a logistics company to a digital delivery utility to one of the largest media production empires on the planet. Every single pivot redefined the fundamental nature of their business model.
And then we reach what the source material describes as the platform pivot. This is when the entire utility and identity of the network changes based on emergent user behavior. And the most jarring, almost comical example of this in tech history is the origin of YouTube.
This is genuinely my favorite piece of startup trivia. YouTube, the platform that fundamentally altered global media, where billions of hours are consumed daily, ranging from university-level quantum physics lectures to massive gaming tournaments, was originally engineered and launched as a video dating website.
It is entirely true. The original slogan registered by the founders was literally, "Tune in, hook up."
I cannot even conceptualize the user interface of early YouTube as a dating site.
It's wild. The founders, Chad Hurley, Steve Chen, and Jawed Karim, built the site with the specific intention that people would upload videos of themselves talking about their ideal partner.
The problem was nobody wanted to do that. It was too awkward, the friction of recording yourself was too high, and the dating profiles were completely empty. The platform was a ghost town.
But the underlying technology they had built was revolutionary. Before YouTube, sharing a video on the internet was a nightmare.
You had to worry about massive file sizes, different video codecs, and downloading specialized media players just to watch a 10-second clip.
Right. The founders had built an infrastructure that utilized flash video technology in the browser, allowing for seamless, one-click playback of compressed video regardless of the user's operating system.
It was a massive technical achievement trapped inside a terrible product premise. And they started to notice that while nobody was uploading dating videos, users were utilizing the underlying infrastructure to upload completely random things.
The famous first video, "Me at the Zoo," or grainy footage of airplanes taking off. People were using the dating site simply because it was the easiest way to host a video file online.
At that moment, the founders had a choice. They could have raised more venture capital and spent millions on marketing, stubbornly trying to force the market to use the platform for dating. They could have paid actors to create fake dating profiles to seed the network.
Instead, they observed the organic server loads. The market was telling them that the dating aspect was irrelevant. The real value was the frictionless video infrastructure itself.
So they dropped the tune-in, hookup branding, removed all the dating-specific features, and up-pivoted into becoming a universal agnostic platform for any video.
They went from a failed niche dating site to the primary video infrastructure of the internet. Less than 2 years after that pivot, Google acquired them for $1.65 billion.
However, we must be careful not to present these narratives as clean, cinematic moments of epiphany. When we tell these stories in retrospect, it sounds like a perfectly rational, smooth process.
Right. Like the founders looked at the analytics dashboard, stroked their chins, executed a brilliant pivot, and woke up as billionaires. The operational reality is infinitely more violent.
Yes, let's talk about the blood on the floor. In the startup ecosystem, this phase is affectionately, or perhaps traumatizingly, referred to as pivot hell.
Pivot hell is the grueling, chaotic purgatory between realizing your original idea is dead and finding the 10x up pivot that actually resonates with the market. It is not a single aha moment.
It is a terrifying sequence of running out of capital, watching your team's morale disintegrate, and launching desperate experiments into the void. The author cites PostHog as a visceral modern example of this.
PostHog is fascinating. Today, they're a massive open-source product analytics platform valued well over $1 billion. But their path there was a nightmare of trial and error. They didn't just pivot once.
Right. They built and launched a tool to help engineers manage technical debt. It failed. They built a tool to monitor website performance. It failed. They built a tool to track user surveys. It failed.
They were burning through their runway, operating in a state of constant existential panic. It was a brutal, iterative process of elimination.
They were systematically disproving hypotheses while their bank account drained. But what kept them alive through pivot hell was their velocity. They weren't spending 6 months building each failed idea.
No, they were building minimum viable products in a matter of weeks, launching them, analyzing the rejection, and immediately moving to the next concept. They were using failure as a high-speed navigation system.
Chaos, punctuated by insight. You're wandering in the dark, bashing your shins against the furniture until you finally stumble into the light switch.
But post-Hog, that light switch was the realization that developers desperately wanted a product analytics suite that they could self-host on their own infrastructure for privacy reasons.
Once they launched that specific iteration, the market response was instantaneous. The friction vanished. That is the reward for surviving pivot hell.
This raises an important question, though. We have mapped out the mechanics of surviving failure and executing the up pivot to achieve product-market fit. But what is the strategic move after you win?
Yeah, what happens when you have survived the chaos, scaled your product, and completely saturated your core market? How do you maintain 10x growth when there is no more room to grow upwards?
Here is where it gets really interesting. Because the author posits that the terminal stage of the up pivot isn't upward at all. Once you achieve market dominance, the mechanics of scale completely invert. The next order of magnitude leap is a sideways leap.
In economic terms, this is the aggressive colonization of adjacent markets. The strategic logic here is profound. When you dominate your first market, you are no longer starting from scratch.
You have amassed an incredible war chest of systemic assets. You have millions of users. You have petabytes of behavioral data. You have deep brand trust. You have a massive server infrastructure. And most importantly, you have established highly liquid network effects.
The sideways leap is the act of leveraging those existing assets to enter entirely new industries with an insurmountable unfair advantage.
The ultimate manifestation of the sideways leap is the super app model, which we see dominating global markets, particularly in Asia. Let's deconstruct the architecture of Grab.
Grab started with a very clear, singular utility. It was a ride-hailing service in Southeast Asia. They spent years and billions of dollars in a brutal price war to acquire users and get those users to trust the platform enough to input their credit card information.
And that is the crux of the matter. In consumer software, the single most difficult and expensive metric is CAC, customer acquisition cost.
Convincing a human being to download an app, create an account, and hand over their payment details is incredibly difficult.
Grab paid that massive CAC to win the ride-hailing market. But once they had millions of users opening their app daily to commute, they realized they possessed immense infrastructural leverage.
They hadn't just built a taxi company. They had built a high-frequency daily utility with zero marginal friction for transactions.
So they execute the sideways leap. They look at their user base and say, we already know exactly where you are, we have a fleet of drivers, and we have your credit card. Why should you open a different app to order lunch?
Boom! GrabFood is born. They leap into the food delivery market, but because they don't have to pay to acquire the users or the drivers, their economics are vastly superior to a standalone food delivery startup.
And they don't stop there. Once you are handling a user's transportation and their daily meals, you are processing a massive amount of their personal transaction volume.
The next logical sideways leap is into the financial sector. GrabPay is launched. They bypass traditional retail banking by allowing users to store funds directly in the app.
From there, it's a seamless step into offering microloans, insurance products, and wealth management. They evolve from a simple transportation utility into an inescapable daily digital ecosystem.
We see the exact same sideways velocity in the B2B sector with Stripe. The Collison brothers initially built Stripe to solve a very specific pain point for developers.
Before Stripe, if a startup wanted to accept credit cards online, they had to deal with legacy banking infrastructure. It required merchant accounts, underwriting processes, and complex integrations that took weeks.
Stripe reduced that entire legacy banking nightmare into 7 lines of elegant code.
It was a massive abstraction layer. By reducing the friction of payments to near zero, Stripe became deeply embedded in the code base of thousands of hypergrowth startups.
They became the fundamental financial plumbing for the internet economy. But processing payments is ultimately a commoditized, low-margin business. The true value was the data visibility.
Exactly. Because Stripe was processing the transactions, they had perfect real-time visibility into the financial health of their clients. They could see a startup's revenue growth, their churn rate, their daily cash flow.
A traditional bank doesn't see that data until the end of the quarter when financial statements are filed. Stripe saw it instantly.
So Stripe leaps sideways. If you know exactly how fast a startup is growing and you control the flow of their incoming revenue, you are in the perfect position to offer them capital.
Stripe leaps into the lending market with Stripe Capital. The underwriting is entirely automated based on the payment data, and the loan is automatically repaid by taking a microscopic percentage of future daily transactions.
It is a completely frictionless lending product that traditional banks simply cannot match. From there, they leap into treasury management, corporate credit cards, and tax automation.
They leverage their initial payment beachhead to become the comprehensive financial operating system for the internet.
The sideways leap relies on utilizing your existing dominance to bully your way into new markets. But what happens when you are facing an opponent who is executing the exact same strategy with the exact same level of talent and the exact same amount of venture capital?
What happens when the immovable object meets the unstoppable force? This brings us to the rarest, highest stakes maneuver in the entire startup playbook.
It is a maneuver that goes against every instinct of the hyper-competitive founder archetype. When two massive entities are fighting to dominate a nascent winner-take-all market, and the customer acquisition costs escalate to the point of mutually assured destruction.
Visionary founders will occasionally suspend their egos and execute a merger of equals.
To understand the sheer magnitude of this move, we have to travel back to the year 2000, to University Avenue in Palo Alto. You have two highly aggressive, deeply paranoid startups located literally in office buildings across the street from one another, locked in a brutal war to dominate the future of online digital payments.
On one side, you have X.com, led by a young Elon Musk. On the other side, you have Confinity, led by Peter Thiel and Max Levchin.
It was a bloodbath. They're both trying to become the primary payment method for the rapidly expanding eBay platform. To acquire users, they were literally giving away cash.
You sign up, they deposit $10 in your account. You refer a friend, they give you another $10. They were burning through millions of dollars a month in venture capital just to steal market share from each other.
The unit economics were completely inverted.
Right.
The faster they grew, the closer they came to absolute bankruptcy. But a merger of equals sounds nice in theory. Structurally, it is a nightmare.
You have two alpha CEOs. You have deeply complex cap tables with different investors who all want to maximize their returns. You have engineering teams with entirely different coding philosophies. How do you convince these warring factions to share a single throne?
You do it through the cold, rational calculus of survival. Both Musk and Thiel realized that the current trajectory led to mutual annihilation, the only way to survive the burn rate.
And more importantly, the only way to establish the absolute monopoly required to defend against traditional banking incumbents
Was to combine forces. They pushed through the massive ego clashes, merged the companies, integrated the underlying technologies, and rebranded the unified entity as PayPal.
And the outcome of that forced marriage is almost difficult to fully process. Yes, they stabilized the burn rate, achieved the monopoly, and successfully sold the combined company to eBay in 2002 for $1.5 billion.
For the investors, it was a massive victory. But the true historical impact of that merger wasn't the product itself. The true outcome was the forging of what became known as the PayPal Mafia.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the pressure cooker of that specific merger created an unparalleled concentration of entrepreneurial talent.
The executives and engineers who learned how to scale a massive network under extreme duress inside that merged company eventually left and dispersed across Silicon Valley.
They took the capital from the eBay sale and the frameworks they learned, and they effectively seeded the next 2 decades of the internet.
The alumni of that single merged company went on to found, fund, or lead Tesla, SpaceX, LinkedIn, YouTube, Yelp, Palantir, Affirm, and countless VC firms.
One single merger birthed a multi-trillion-dollar generation of unicorns.
Which brings us to a critical inflection point in our analysis. We've detailed the mechanics of these massive strategic shifts. But knowing the history is different from executing the maneuver.
Every founder listening to this will eventually face a deeply personal dilemma. When the data turns against you, do you fiercely protect the original product you birthed, or do you ruthlessly kill it to make room for the up pivot?
The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. We casually discuss Kevin Systrom deleting the Bourbon code base, but imagine what that actually feels like.
You're asking a founder to look at their engineering team in the eye, people who have worked 80-hour weeks for a year, and say, everything we built is wrong, throw it in the trash.
It requires a highly contradictory psychological profile. You have to possess the immense ego required to believe you can change the world, paired with the absolute humility required to admit you have no idea how to actually do it.
The author distills this psychological tightrope into a very practical, operational playbook. He recognizes that founders are human, and human beings are highly susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy.
We irrationally cling to failing projects simply because we have already invested time and money into them. To combat this, he outlines 4 specific, institutionalized habits designed to force founders to continuously audit their reality.
Let's examine the architecture of this playbook. Habit number 1 is perhaps the most difficult to execute honestly. Audit your ambition quarterly.
This isn't just a casual check-in. The framework suggests that every 90 days, the founding team must isolate themselves and ask a brutal hypothetical question.
If a catastrophic event wiped out our entire code base, our product, and our current strategy tonight, and we woke up tomorrow morning with our current bank balance and our current team, what would we build from scratch?
It is a brilliant mechanism for neutralizing the sunk cost fallacy. If the honest answer to that question is we would build something entirely different, then you have mathematically proven that your current product is a historical artifact holding you back.
If you wouldn't willingly choose to build your current product today, why are you spending tomorrow's runway defending it?
Exactly. Habit number 2 is map adjacent opportunities. This is the prerequisite for the sideways leap. It requires founders to stop viewing their company as a single product and start viewing it as a collection of infrastructural assets.
You have to objectively inventory your data reservoirs, the trust equity of your brand, and the behavioral patterns of your users. And then you ask, what entirely different, massive problems could these exact same assets solve with near zero customer acquisition cost?
This is how Grab saw food delivery hidden inside ride-hailing. Habit number 3 focuses on external awareness. Build a merger radar.
Founders are naturally conditioned by capitalism to view competitors as mortal enemies that must be crushed into dust.
The 10x mindset requires a more nuanced game theory. It asks founders to continuously monitor the landscape for companies that are similar in size or complementary in their capabilities.
You have to constantly run the calculus. If we continue this price war, we both burn our capital. If we merge our technologies, do we immediately create an insurmountable monopoly?
It requires viewing rivals not just as threats, but as potential puzzle pieces for a massive up-pivot.
And finally, habit number 4 is the overarching philosophy of the entire system. Pivot early, pivot often, but pivot upward.
It is the realization that the market is a chaotic, rapidly evolving organism. Your product will inevitably become misaligned with the market. Pivoting is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of sensory awareness.
But the critical constraint is directionality. A defensive pivot that retreats into a smaller, safer, more niche market is just a slow death sentence.
Every strategic shift must aggressively expand the total addressable opportunity. You never shrink the vision, you only ever expand the perimeter.
So we have thoroughly established the internal mechanics of scaling the product and scaling the vision. We understand the necessity of surviving pivot hell and the aggressive nature of the sideways leap.
You have executed the playbook, and you possess a product with genuine, validated 10x potential. But structurally, that is only half of the equation.
This transitions us into the second half of the deep dive, which focuses on the mechanics of distribution. Because a 10x product with a 1x distribution channel is fundamentally useless.
It's a Ferrari stuck in a dirt driveway.
Yeah.
If your audience does not scale at the exact same exponential rate as your product architecture, you have simply built a multi-million-dollar ghost town.
And this brings us to the second highly provocative text in our source material.
The author drops a strategic bombshell here. He shifts the focus from engineering the product to engineering the growth. And the core thesis is encapsulated in a deeply counterintuitive directive. Stop doing your own marketing.
In the context of modern startup culture, that statement borders on heresy. The entire ethos of Silicon Valley, especially in the early stages, is built on aggressive, do-it-yourself scrappiness.
The mythology celebrates the founder who writes the code at 2 a.m., answers the customer support emails at 6 a.m., and manages the Facebook ad campaigns over lunch. You wear all the hats.
That DIY ethos was functional in 2010. But the author's central argument is that treating digital marketing as an internal amateur side project in the year 2026 is a massive systemic error.
To illustrate why this is so dangerous, he uses a brilliant historical framework regarding the evolution of outsourcing and the theory of the firm.
This historical analogy is incredible because it perfectly explains the shift from capital expenditures to operational expenditures. I want you listening to visualize a massive manufacturing plant in the 1920s. Think of a booming textile factory or a massive steel mill.
In that era, a factory didn't just build textiles. They had to physically manufacture their own electricity. They constructed massive, incredibly loud, highly dangerous coal or diesel power plants right there on the factory grounds.
The inefficiencies were staggering. A textile company had to allocate massive amounts of upfront capital capex just to build the power infrastructure.
They had to hire specialized mechanical engineers to shovel coal, monitor boiler pressure, and maintain the turbines. It was a constant, dangerous distraction from their actual core competency, which was designing and manufacturing textiles.
But they had absolutely no choice. It was a closed system. And then a massive paradigm shift occurs. The electrical grid arrives.
Companies like General Electric and Westinghouse spend billions building centralized, massive, highly efficient power networks. Suddenly, the entire architecture of manufacturing changes.
A factory no longer needs to build a coal plant. They literally just run a copper wire out to the street and plug into the centralized grid.
The systemic implications of that single act of outsourcing were revolutionary. Electricity transitioned from a massive fixed capital expense into a flexible, variable operational expense, OPEX.
The cost per kilowatt plummeted due to economies of scale. The reliability skyrocketed. But the most profound shift was in cognitive focus.
Factory owners no longer had to lay awake at night worrying about boiler explosions. They could redirect 100% of their talent and their mental bandwidth entirely into product design and manufacturing innovation.
They outsourced the utility to focus on the core advantage. If a founder walked into a venture capital pitch today and said, "We're launching a revolutionary new shoe brand, and step one of our roadmap is securing a permit to build a small coal plant behind our warehouse to power the sewing machines,"
The investors would have them escorted out of the building. It sounds utterly absurd.
because it is absurd. But the author astutely points out that the tech industry went through this exact same painful, inefficient learning curve regarding digital infrastructure very recently. We call it the cloud revolution.
If you rewind to the early 2000s tech boom, the architecture of a startup looked exactly like those 1920s factories. If you had a visionary idea for a web application, you couldn't just write code.
You had to physically purchase massive, incredibly expensive metal server racks. You had to lease literal square footage in a climate-controlled data center.
You had to install complex cooling systems, and you had to hire a dedicated team of network security specialists just to keep the blinking lights on.
It was the exact same CapEx nightmare. It severely throttled innovation. If a startup's app suddenly went viral, their physical servers would melt down under the traffic load.
The site would crash, and the founders would be frantically calling Dell to rush deliver more hardware, which would take weeks to install.
And then, around 2008, the tech equivalent of the electrical grid arrived. Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure. They took raw computing power and completely abstracted it into a utility.
You no longer bought a server. You simply rented compute power by the millisecond. You plugged your code into their massive, centralized grid.
The friction vanished. A startup could scale their server capacity 10x in 5 minutes with a few clicks, using a fraction of the upfront capital.
They didn't need a basement full of hardware. They just needed an AWS account. The management of the utility was outsourced, allowing the engineers to focus entirely on the product logic.
This raises an important question, which is the crux of the author's entire thesis. If we collectively agree that it is objectively absurd for a factory to build its own coal plant, and we agree that it is objectively absurd for a modern startup to build its own physical server farm,
Why do founders still stubbornly, aggressively insist on trying to build incredibly complex digital marketing engines completely from scratch inside their own companies?
because they fundamentally misclassify what modern marketing actually is. They still view marketing through the lens of the Don Draper era as an art form of writing a clever slogan or designing a pretty billboard.
But in 2026, digital growth is not an art form. It is highly complex, mathematically rigorous, algorithmic infrastructure.
Let's dissect the components of a modern 2026 growth stack. To scale a company today, you are engaging in algorithmic warfare against the smartest machine learning models on Earth.
You need absolute mastery in performance advertising, which means navigating automated bid shading and algorithmic targeting across Meta, Google, TikTok, and emerging platforms.
You need programmatic SEO architectures that can withstand constant updates to generative AI search experiences.
Furthermore, you need high-velocity, multivariate creative testing, utilizing AI to generate thousands of ad variants per week. You need incredibly complex attribution modeling to understand the exact touch points that drive conversions in a privacy-first, cookieless web environment.
You need rigorous cohort analysis to track the lifetime value to customer acquisition cost ratio over time. It is an entire universe of deeply specialized, highly technical disciplines.
And how does the typical startup attempt to build this infrastructure? They don't. They engage in a devastating organizational trope. They hire one single enthusiastic human being,
Yeah.
the tragic phenomenon of the marketing generalist.
It is an act of organizational cruelty. A startup raises a Series A, they hire a smart, ambitious 26-year-old, they bestow upon them the title of head of growth, and they say, okay, our target is to triple revenue this year. Go do all of it.
Manage the million-dollar ad budget. Optimize the programmatic SEO. Write the weekly newsletter. Maintain the brand voice on social media. Configure the attribution dashboards, and present the cohort analysis to the board on Tuesday.
It is the equivalent of asking one person to operate the navigation, the sonar, the engine room, and the torpedo tubes of a nuclear submarine simultaneously. It is mathematically impossible.
What happens in reality is that the generalist frantically tries to keep their head above water. They do a mediocre job at running a few basic Facebook ads. They completely ignore the deep infrastructural analytics, and within 9 months, they are entirely burned out.
Or, if they're actually talented, they realize the startup cannot support them, and they get poached by a larger tech firm with actual resources.
And the moment the generalist leaves, the startup's entire growth machine instantly stalls out. They have to start the hiring process all over again. Meanwhile, their competitors, the ones who have realized that marketing is now an external infrastructure, are compounding your growth at light speed.
The new paradigm dictates that marketing should no longer be structured as an internal department. It must be treated as an external grid that you plug into.
But I know exactly what the founders listening to this are thinking right now. The pushback is visceral. If I take my marketing and outsource it to an external agency grid, don't I completely hollow out the soul of my company?
What happens to my brand voice? I am not handing over the identity of the product I built to a bunch of mercenary media buyers who don't understand our culture.
It is a completely valid fear. Outsourcing growth traditionally meant receiving highly generic, completely soulless advertising campaigns. But the author addresses this friction brilliantly with an organizational architecture he calls the Michelin star synergy.
The core misunderstanding is the assumption that outsourcing means firing your internal team. You do not fire your team. Your internal marketers are absolutely vital.
They are the keepers of the empathy. They possess the deep product knowledge, the cultural alignment, and the intuitive grasp of the brand's unique voice. They are the custodians of the narrative.
The analogy he uses to explain this integration is flawless. He asks you to conceptualize your internal marketing team as a visionary, highly talented chef. That chef understands the precise flavor profiles, the sourcing of the ingredients, and the emotional experience of the meal. They possess the culinary genius.
But a visionary chef should absolutely never spend their day driving the delivery trucks to pick up the produce. They shouldn't be writing the code for the online reservation platform, or negotiating real estate leases, or managing the payroll software.
The external growth infrastructure is the equivalent of a massive, heavily capitalized Michelin star restaurant group. They provide the highly efficient supply chains, the predictive analytics for foot traffic, the operational capital, and the massive scale.
The magic happens when you integrate the two.
Yeah.
You combine the irreplaceable soul and vision of the chef with the ruthless computational efficiency of the restaurant group's infrastructure.
That APIification of human capital is how you achieve explosive, culturally resonant scale. The author lays out a highly specific 3-layer organizational architecture to actually build this synergy.
Layer 1 is the internal marketing leadership. This is your in-house team. They are no longer bogged down in the minutiae of adjusting ad bids. They operate purely at the strategic and creative layer.
They interface directly with the product engineers. They translate the company's grand vision into specific growth priorities and ensure absolute brand consistency.
Layer 2 is the external growth infrastructure. This is the centralized grid. These are the specialized, highly technical teams handling the algorithmic execution. The multi-platform ad buyers, the data engineers building the attribution models, the SEO technicians.
And here is the crucial asymmetric advantage of this layer. Because these external infrastructure teams are actively managing hundreds of millions of dollars in ad spend across dozens of different hypergrowth companies simultaneously, they possess real-time market data that no single startup could ever legally access on its own.
It is the ultimate informational leverage. If Meta or Google radically changes their ad algorithm on a Tuesday morning, an isolated internal marketing generalist might take 6 weeks and burn $50,000 in failed ad spend trying to diagnose why the CAC suddenly spiked.
But an external infrastructure team identifies the algorithmic shift by Tuesday afternoon because they instantly see the exact same anomaly across 50 different enterprise dashboards. They adjust the bidding strategies globally before the internal team even realizes there is a problem.
Layer 3 is the glue that holds it together. Integrated feedback loops. The traditional broken agency model involves tossing a budget over a brick wall and waiting for a PDF report at the end of the month.
The Michelin star architecture requires tight API-level integration. It mandates shared, real-time data dashboards, unified KPI targets, weekly strategic sprints, and continuous, rapid experimentation.
The external team handles the computational execution, feeds the data back to the internal team, who then refine the creative vision. It creates a closed-loop, highly resilient learning system.
And when you analyze why the specific model dominates the modern landscape, it comes down to 4 structural advantages. Speed. You have the bandwidth to run continuous, high-velocity experiments across every channel simultaneously.
Cost efficiency.
Yeah.
You are fractionalizing the cost of world-class, highly specialized data engineers, rather than attempting to hold them all on your internal payroll.
Resilience. You are insulated against sudden platform shocks and algorithm updates because you are plugged into a grid with massive informational volume.
And the fourth advantage is the most critical for the survival of the company: focus. By plugging the growth engine into the grid, the founders and the core engineering teams buy back their cognitive bandwidth.
They can actually concentrate all of their energy on building a 10x better product rather than drowning in the granular settings of a Google Ads account.
So what does this all mean for the fundamental nature of entrepreneurship? If we extrapolate these frameworks to their logical conclusion, it creates a bit of an existential crisis for the founder archetype.
If you are no longer shoveling the coal for the power plant, and you are no longer racking the physical servers, and now you are no longer operating the growth and marketing engine, what exactly is your actual job?
If you strip away all of the tactical, operational busy work, what is left of the CEO?
So what does this all mean? It is a profound shift in identity. You are moving from being the bricklayer to being the architect. The author's thesis redefines the entire purpose of the executive layer.
The founder's job is not to run every system inside the company. The founder's job is to architect and continuously optimize the macro systems that actually run the company.
It is the final transition from working in your business to working on your business. When you treat execution as a utility, your responsibilities narrow down to a highly potent, incredibly difficult set of core directives.
You must define the overarching visionary strategy. You must possess the courage to execute the up pivots when the data demands it. You must hire truly exceptional, culturally aligned leadership. You must secure the capital required to fund the infrastructure.
And you must be the philosophical steward of the product's ultimate utility. Literally everything else, every tactical execution, must be aggressively outsourced to a specialized utility grid.
If you are a founder in 2026, and you are still insisting on building your own marketing engines from scratch, you are effectively choosing to pay a massive premium in time and capital for amateur-scale results.
You are fighting a war with a musket while your competitors are using satellite guidance. The secret to exponential growth is not working 100 hours a week on tactical execution. The secret is aggressively refusing to do the execution yourself and plugging your vision into the grid.
It has been a massive, deeply structural journey today. We have completely deconstructed the epistemology of failure, proving that a 90% mortality rate is just the cost of data acquisition.
We explored how the unicorns scale not by patching leaks, but by executing continuous, ruthless 10x up pivots. We mapped the aggressive mechanics of the sideways leap into adjacent markets and the ego-crushing realities of the merger of equals.
And finally, we detail why the future of scale relies on abandoning the DIY ethos and treating growth as a plug-and-play algorithmic infrastructure.
It provides a comprehensive operational blueprint for escaping the gravitational pull of incremental 10% thinking. But as we wrap up this analysis, there is a fascinating, deeply provocative philosophical thread that emerges when you overlay these frameworks onto the author's broader technological predictions.
We noted at the beginning that his other essays deal heavily with the dawn of the 10x economy, and specifically the rapid advancement of agentic AI.
Right. We are moving beyond large language models that just chat or summarize text. We are entering the era of AI agents that possess the autonomy to analyze data, formulate strategies, and actually execute complex, multi-step workflows across the internet without human intervention.
Exactly. So let's track the historical trajectory of outsourcing we've established today. First, we outsource the physical power plant to the electrical grid. Then we outsource the physical computing hardware to the cloud grid.
Today, we are outsourcing the complex algorithmic marketing engine to specialized growth grids. The trajectory is a relentless drive to abstract away tactical execution.
But as we move deeper into this prophesied age of abundance, powered by highly capable agentic AI, what happens when the operational strategy itself becomes a utility?
That is a staggering proposition. We have automated the hands of the company. Are we approaching a state where we automate the central nervous system?
Could the ultimate final up pivot be an architectural model where a startup effectively outsources the functional role of its own CEO?
Yeah.
Imagine a structure where you plug your startup into a centralized AI grid for all tactical resource allocation, market analysis, and operational leadership.
Outsourcing the CEO to the grid, the AI acts as the perfect emotionless executive, instantly executing up pivots based on real-time global data, free from the sunk cost fallacy or founder ego.
Leaving the human founders to act purely as the philosophical, empathetic soul of the entity. They define the why, and the agentic machine seamlessly handles the how and the what.
It is the ultimate separation of vision from execution. The founder becomes the philosopher king, and the algorithmic systems silently run the empire. It is a wild, borderline science fiction concept, yet logically, it is the exact trajectory dictated by the frameworks we've analyzed today.
It fundamentally forces you to ask, in a fully automated economy, what is the irreplaceable value of the human being?
We will leave you to mull over that massive futuristic possibility. We hope we have effectively broken down the architecture of scale and provided some rigorous 10x inspiration for whatever systems you are building. Thank you for joining us on this exploration, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.